Welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where history and geography intertwine to tell the stories of our world's most fascinating places. Tonight, we journey to the southern reaches of South America, to a land where the Andes touch the sky and endless plains stretch toward horizons that seem to hold infinity itself. This is Argentina, a nation whose very geography has shaped its destiny, whose vast expanse contains within it the echoes of ancient civilizations, the footprints of Spanish conquistadors, and the dreams of millions who crossed oceans seeking a new beginning. As you settle into the quiet comfort of this evening hour, allow yourself to be transported across continents and through centuries. Tonight's exploration will carry us through the remarkable tapestry that is Argentina, from the windswept plateaus of Patagonia to the fertile plains of the Pampas, from the pre-Columbian settlements that first called this land home to the modern nation that emerged from centuries of transformation. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where and what time you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see how far this community reaches around the world. And if you're enjoying this series, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future deep dives. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of Argentina. Chapter 1: Introduction and Geographic Foundations. Argentina stands as the 8th largest country in the world, a colossus that spans nearly 2.8 million square kilometers. To truly comprehend this vast scale, imagine a territory that stretches from the subtropical north, where palm trees sway in humid breezes, all the way south to the subantarctic regions, where glaciers carve their ancient paths through mountain valleys. This is a land that encompasses not merely size, but an extraordinary diversity of landscapes, climates, and natural wonders that few nations on Earth can match. The country's position in South America places it at the crossroads of continental influences. Bordered by Chile's narrow Pacific coast to the west, Bolivia's high plateaus and Paraguay's riverine landscapes to the north, Brazil's expansive territories and Uruguay's rolling hills to the northeast, and the vast South Atlantic Ocean to the east, Argentina occupies a unique geographic position that has profoundly influenced its historical development and cultural identity. Let us begin our geographic exploration with the mighty Andes Mountains, that great spine of South America that forms Argentina's western boundary with Chile. The Andean region extends some 2,300 miles along the western edge of the country, from Bolivia to southern Patagonia, forming most of the natural boundary with Chile. These mountains are not merely a border, they are the architects of Argentina's climate, the source of its rivers, and the foundation upon which much of its early history was built. In the northwest, the Andes rise to their most dramatic heights within Argentine territory. Here, in the provinces of Catamarca, La Rioja, and San Juan, peaks soar above 22,000 feet, their snow-capped summits piercing the thin air of the high altiplano. Aconcagua, the highest peak in both the western and southern hemispheres, stands as a silent sentinel at 22,837 feet, a testament to the geological forces that have shaped this continent over millions of years. As the Andes extend southward, they gradually diminish in height but maintain their profound influence on the nation's geography. The central Andean region, encompassing the provinces of Mendoza and San Juan, represents one of Argentina's most economically significant geographic areas. Here, the rain-shadow effect of the mountains creates ideal conditions for viticulture, transforming what might otherwise be arid land into some of the world's finest wine-producing regions. The combination of high altitude, abundant sunshine, and careful water management from Andean snowmelt has created an agricultural paradise that contributes significantly to Argentina's modern economy. Moving eastward from the Andes, we encounter the vast central plains, more commonly known as the Pampas. The Pampas is predominantly a grassland plain and includes the country's major metropolitan cities. This region represents the geographical heart of Argentina, both literally and figuratively. Stretching across roughly 600,000 square kilometers, the Pampas encompass not only the federal capital of Buenos Aires, but also the provinces of La Pampa, most of Buenos Aires province, and portions of Córdoba, Santa Fe, and Entre Rios. The Pampas are perhaps best understood as nature's gift to human settlement and agricultural development. These fertile plains, enriched by centuries of geological processes and blessed with a temperate climate, have supported human habitation for thousands of years. The deep, rich soils formed by the accumulation of loess deposits carried by winds from Patagonia and sediments from the Paraná River system create one of the world's most productive agricultural regions. The geography of the Pampas is characterized by its gentle undulation, with vast stretches of grassland broken only by occasional low hills and river valleys. The Paraná River system, including its major tributary, the Uruguay River, drains much of northern Argentina and provides both transportation corridors and fertile alluvial deposits that further enrich the soil. These waterways have served as highways for human migration and trade for millennia, connecting the interior of the continent with the Atlantic Ocean and the wider world beyond. The climate of the Pampas reflects its geographic position and topographic characteristics. Situated largely between 31 and 39 degrees south latitude, this region enjoys a temperate climate with 4 distinct seasons. Rainfall, generally adequate for agriculture, decreases as one moves westward toward the Andes, creating distinct subregions within the Greater Pampa. The humid Pampas, closer to the Atlantic coast, receive more precipitation and support more intensive agriculture, while the dry Pampas, toward the west, are better suited to cattle ranching and extensive farming. South of the Pampas lies one of the most distinctive and dramatic geographic regions in South America, Patagonia. Patagonia spans across the southernmost region of Argentina and Chile. This vast area is sparsely populated and includes geographical landmarks such as the Andes Mountains, glaciers, and expansive plateaus. Argentine Patagonia, encompassing roughly 770,000 square kilometers, represents nearly 30% of the nation's total territory, yet contains less than 5% of its population. The geography of Patagonia defies simple description. It is a land of extremes and contrasts, where wind-swept steppes give way to pristine lakes, where glaciers descend from ice fields to meet temperate rainforests, and where the rhythm of life moves to ancient patterns largely unchanged by the modern world. The Argentine side is divided east to west into 3 geographic regions: coastal Patagonia, central Patagonia, and Andean Patagonia. Coastal Patagonia, stretching along the Atlantic shore, presents a landscape shaped by millions of years of marine influence. Here, dramatic cliffs rise from pebble beaches, peninsulas jut into the South Atlantic, and countless bays and inlets provide shelter for marine wildlife. The Peninsula Valdez, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, exemplifies this coastal geography, serving as a breeding ground for southern right whales, elephant seals, and sea lions. The coastline's configuration creates numerous microclimates and habitats, supporting ecosystems found nowhere else on Earth. Central Patagonia consists primarily of vast plateaus and steppes, elevated tablelands that stretch seemingly without end toward every horizon. These mesetas, as they are locally known, rise gradually from east to west, their surfaces covered with hardy grasses and shrubs adapted to the region's arid climate and constant winds. The landscape here possesses an almost lunar quality, stark, beautiful, and profoundly moving in its emptiness. Rivers have carved deep canyons through these plateaus, creating dramatic gorges and revealing geological formations that tell the story of ancient seas, volcanic activity, and climatic changes spanning millions of years. Andean Patagonia, the western portion of the region, presents perhaps the most spectacular mountain scenery in South America. Here, the Andes transform from the high, dry peaks of the north to a landscape of glacial lakes, temperate rainforests, and ice fields. The southern Patagonian ice field, shared with Chile, represents the third largest concentration of ice outside the polar regions. Glaciers such as the Perito, Moreno, and Uppsala create living laboratories where visitors can observe the dynamic processes of glacial advance and retreat that have shaped Patagonian geography for millions of years. The climate of Patagonia reflects its southern latitude and its exposure to the unimpeded westerly winds that circle the Southern Ocean. These winds, unblocked by any significant landmass as they sweep across the South Pacific, arrive at the Patagonian coast carrying moisture that falls as precipitation on the western slopes of the Andes. This creates a dramatic rain shadow effect, with the western slopes receiving abundant rainfall that supports temperate rainforests, while the eastern plains remain relatively arid. Northern Argentina encompasses several distinct geographic regions, each contributing to the nation's remarkable diversity. The northwest, including the provinces of Salta, Jujuy, Tucumán, Santiago del Estero, and Catamarca, represents a geographic and cultural bridge between the Andean highlands and the subtropical lowlands. This region contains some of Argentina's most varied topography, from the high plateau of the Puna de Atacama, where elevations exceed 13,000 feet, to the cloud forests of the eastern Andean slopes. The Puna, Argentina's portion of the high Andean plateau, shares characteristics with the altiplano regions of Bolivia and Peru. Here, the landscape takes on an almost otherworldly quality, with vast salt flats, volcanic cones, and high-altitude lakes creating vistas that seem drawn from dreams rather than terrestrial reality. The Salinas Grandes, extensive salt flats that glisten white under the intense high-altitude sun, exemplify this unique geography. These formations result from ancient lake beds that have evaporated over thousands of years, leaving behind concentrated mineral deposits that create some of the most striking landscapes in South America. Descending eastward from the high Andes, the geography transitions through a series of valleys and broken ranges before reaching the Chaco region. The Gran Chaco, shared with Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil, represents one of South America's largest lowland areas. In Argentina, the Chaco encompasses portions of the provinces of Chaco, Formosa, Santiago del Estero, and eastern Salta. This region's geography is characterized by vast alluvial plains, slow-moving rivers, wetlands, and forests adapted to the subtropical climate. The Mesopotamia region, occupying the area between the Paraná and Uruguay rivers, completes Argentina's major geographic divisions. This region, encompassing the provinces of Entre Rios, Corrientes, and Misiones, possesses a geography shaped by river systems and blessed with abundant rainfall. The landscape here is characterized by rolling hills, wetlands, and in the north, the spectacular Iguazú Falls, where the Iguazú River plunges over volcanic rock formations to create one of the world's most impressive waterfalls. The geographic diversity we have explored creates distinct climate zones that have profoundly influenced human settlement patterns throughout Argentine history. The subtropical north, with its hot, humid summers and mild winters, supports different forms of agriculture and human activity than the temperate Pampas or the cold, windy expanses of Patagonia. These climate variations have created distinct regional cultures, each adapted to local geographic conditions and each contributing to the rich tapestry of Argentine identity. Understanding Argentina's geography provides essential context for comprehending the human story that has unfolded across this remarkable landscape. The vast distances, varied climates, and natural resources have all played crucial roles in determining where people settled, how they lived, what they produced, and how they related to both their environment and to each other. From the earliest indigenous settlements to the modern nation-state, geography has been the silent partner in every chapter of Argentine history. As we prepare to delve deeper into this story, remember that every human drama we will explore, from the sophisticated civilizations that flourished before European contact to the massive waves of immigration that transformed the nation in the 19th and 20th centuries, played out against this geographic backdrop. The mountains and plains, rivers and coasts, forests and grasslands of Argentina are not merely scenic elements in our historical narrative. They are active participants that have shaped every aspect of the human experience in this remarkable corner of South America. Chapter 2: Pre-Columbian Argentina and Indigenous Peoples. In the time before European ships appeared on the horizon of the Rio de la Plata, the diverse landscapes of Argentina were home to numerous indigenous peoples, each group intimately connected to the geographic regions we have just explored. Their stories, woven into the very fabric of the land itself, represent thousands of years of human adaptation, innovation, and cultural development that laid the foundation for all subsequent chapters of Argentine history. The earliest evidence of human presence in what is now Argentina dates back approximately 13,000 years to the end of the last ice age, when nomadic hunters first crossed the land, bridges and mountain passes that connected North and South America. These pioneering peoples found themselves in a land of extraordinary diversity, where glacial retreat had created new valleys, where changing climates were establishing the ecosystems that would define the continent for millennia to come, and where abundant wildlife provided both challenges and opportunities for human survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that these early inhabitants were sophisticated hunters and gatherers who developed complex strategies for surviving in Argentina's varied environments. In Patagonia, sites such as Cueva de las Manos reveal not only evidence of human habitation dating back nearly 10,000 years, but also some of South America's most remarkable prehistoric art. The cave paintings of Cueva de las Manos, with their distinctive stenciled handprints and dynamic hunting scenes, provide a window into the spiritual and cultural world of these early Patagonians. The people who created these remarkable artworks were likely ancestors of the groups that Europeans would later encounter, peoples who had developed sophisticated knowledge of their environment and complex social structures adapted to the challenges of Patagonian life. The cave paintings depict not only human hands but also guanacos, rheas, and other animals that formed the basis of the Patagonian economy. The artistic techniques and symbolic content suggest well-developed cultural traditions that were passed down through generations of indigenous peoples. As we move northward from Patagonia into the Pampas region, The archaeological record reveals different patterns of indigenous settlement and cultural development. The vast grasslands of the Pampas supported different forms of human adaptation than the windswept plateaus of the south. Here, indigenous peoples developed strategies for life on the plains that would later influence European settlers and contribute to the distinctive culture of the Argentine gaucho. The Querendí, South American Indians who inhabited the Argentine Pampas between Cabo Blanco on the Atlantic coast and the Córdoba Mountains on the western shores of the Rio de la Plata. The Querendí represent one of the most historically significant indigenous groups of the Pampas region, not only because of their sophisticated adaptation to grassland life, but also because they were among the first indigenous peoples to encounter Spanish explorers in the early 16th century. The Querendí had developed a semi-nomadic lifestyle perfectly adapted to the geography and ecology of the Pampas. They moved seasonally across the grasslands following herds of guanaco and rhea, harvesting wild plants and roots, and taking advantage of the varied resources offered by different microenvironments within the larger Pampa ecosystem. Their knowledge of the region was encyclopedic. They knew where to find fresh water during dry seasons, which plants could provide nutrition during lean times, how to read weather patterns and animal behavior, and how to navigate across vast distances using subtle geographic markers invisible to outsiders. The social organization of the Querendí reflected their environmental adaptation. They lived in small, mobile groups that could respond quickly to changes in resource availability. Their material culture was characterized by portability and multifunctionality tools, weapons, and household items that could serve multiple purposes and could be easily transported across the plains. This adaptive flexibility would prove crucial when they encountered the profound changes brought by European contact. In the northwestern regions of Argentina, where the Andes create dramatically different environmental conditions, indigenous peoples developed entirely different forms of social organization and cultural expression. The Diaguita Calchaquí of northern Argentina are said to number 13,773. Historically, they were among the most advanced pre-Columbian cultures in Argentina. Their advanced Bronze Age skills included dyeing and weaving textiles, hand-painted ceramics, advanced irrigation systems, and more. The Diaguita Calchaquí peoples represented the pinnacle of pre-Columbian technological and cultural achievement in Argentina. Unlike the nomadic peoples of the Pampas and Patagonia, the Diaguita had developed sedentary agricultural societies, supported by sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed the arid valleys of the northwest into productive agricultural regions. Their engineering achievements included terraced hillsides that prevented erosion while creating additional farmland, canal systems that channeled water from mountain streams to fields, sometimes many kilometers away, and storage systems that allowed them to maintain food supplies through seasonal variations in agricultural productivity. The material culture of the Diaguita peoples reflected their sophisticated social organization and technological capabilities. Their ceramic traditions produced not only functional pottery but also artistic works of remarkable beauty and complexity. Diaguita ceramics featured geometric designs, animal motifs, and abstract patterns that conveyed both aesthetic and symbolic meaning. The sophistication of their ceramic traditions suggests not only technical skill, but also complex systems of artistic training, cultural transmission, and aesthetic appreciation. Textile production among the Diaguita peoples reached levels of sophistication that impressed even Spanish colonists accustomed to European craftsmanship. Using fibers from domesticated llamas and alpacas, as well as wild vicuñas, they created textiles of extraordinary quality and beauty. Their dyeing techniques, utilizing plant materials available in the Andean environment, produced colors that remained vibrant for centuries. The patterns and designs woven into Diaguita textiles conveyed complex cultural information, including social status, religious beliefs, and tribal affiliations. The metallurgical skills of the Diaguita peoples represented another remarkable achievement of pre-Columbian Argentine civilization. They developed techniques for working copper, bronze, gold, and silver, creating both functional tools and ornamental objects of great beauty. Their metalworking included not only basic techniques such as hammering and casting, but also sophisticated methods such as alloying different metals to create materials with specific properties. The gold and silver work of the Diaguita peoples was particularly renowned, producing ornaments and religious objects that demonstrated both technical skill and artistic vision. The agricultural systems developed by the Diaguita peoples transformed the geography of northwestern Argentina. They cultivated corn, quinoa, potatoes, and other crops using techniques adapted to high-altitude conditions and arid climates. Their agricultural innovations included not only irrigation systems, but also crop rotation methods, soil enrichment techniques, and storage systems that allowed them to maintain food security in an often challenging environment. The social organization of Diaguita society was complex and hierarchical, reflecting their sophisticated economic base and technological achievements. They developed systems of political leadership, religious hierarchy, and social stratification that supported large populations in permanent settlements. Their religious beliefs, deeply connected to the Andean landscape, included worship of mountain spirits, agricultural deities, and ancestral figures that reflected their intimate relationship with their environment. In the late 15th century, the native tribes of the Quebrada de Humahuaca were conquered by the Inca Empire under Topa Inca Yupanqui to secure the supply of metals such as silver, zinc, and copper. This Inca expansion into what is now northwestern Argentina represents one of the most significant developments in pre-Columbian Argentine history. The incorporation of parts of northwestern Argentina into the vast Inca Empire brought new technologies, administrative systems, and cultural influences that would profoundly impact indigenous societies in the region. The Inca administration introduced new agricultural techniques, architectural styles, and systems of organization that blended with existing indigenous traditions to create unique hybrid cultures. The famous Inca road system extended into northwestern Argentina, connecting local communities with the broader Andean world and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices across vast distances. These roads, built with characteristic Inca engineering skill, included bridges, rest stations, and supply depots that supported both administrative control and economic exchange. The Inca influence also brought new religious concepts and practices that blended with existing indigenous beliefs. The Inca reverence for Inti, the sun god, and their worship of mountain spirits found common ground with local religious traditions, creating syncretic belief systems that would survive both Inca conquest and later Spanish colonization. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals temples, ceremonial sites, and artistic works that combine Inca and local indigenous elements in fascinating and complex ways. In the northeastern regions of Argentina, along the rivers that drain into the Rio de la Plata system, different indigenous peoples developed cultures adapted to riverine environments. The most populous indigenous groups were the Guarani, among others. The Guarani number 68,454 people today. The Guarani peoples, who occupied territories extending from Brazil through Paraguay into northeastern Argentina, developed one of South America's most influential indigenous cultures. The Guarani adaptation to riverine environments created a distinctive way of life that combined agriculture with fishing, hunting, and gathering. They developed sophisticated canoe-building techniques that allowed them to navigate the complex river systems of the Paraná and Uruguay basins. Their knowledge of river navigation, seasonal flooding patterns, and aquatic resources made them masters of their riverine environment. The Guarani had a great impact on Argentine culture. For example, mate was consumed by the Guarani and Tupi peoples in pre-colonial times. The cultural influence of the Guarani extended far beyond their immediate territories. Their agricultural techniques, particularly their cultivation of corn, sweet potatoes, and other crops, provided models that would later be adopted by European colonists. Their knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties contributed to a pharmacological tradition that continues to influence Argentine culture today. The social organization of Guarani society was based on extended family groups that lived in large communal houses called maloca. These structures, which could house several dozen people, reflected the communal nature of Guarani society and their emphasis on cooperation and shared resources. The Guarani developed complex kinship systems, religious practices, and systems of leadership that maintained social cohesion across widely scattered communities. Guarani religious beliefs were deeply connected to their forest and riverine environment. They developed sophisticated mythologies that explained the creation of the world, the relationship between humans and nature, and the proper ways to live in harmony with their environment. Their religious practices included shamanism, communal rituals, and individual spiritual quests that maintained the connection between the human and natural worlds. In the vast expanses of Patagonia, indigenous peoples developed cultures uniquely adapted to the challenges of life in one of the world's most demanding environments. The Tehuelche, Mapuche, and other Patagonian peoples created societies that could thrive in conditions of extreme wind, cold, and resource scarcity. Their adaptations included not only sophisticated hunting techniques, but also complex social organizations that allowed them to maintain cultural continuity across enormous territories and harsh environmental conditions. Archaeological finds have shown that Mapuche culture existed in Chile and Argentina as early as 600 to 500 BC. Genetically, the Mapuche differ from the adjacent indigenous peoples of Patagonia. The Mapuche peoples, whose name means people of the earth, developed one of the most successful and enduring indigenous cultures in South America. Their society was characterized by a fierce independence that would later enable them to resist both Inca expansion and Spanish conquest more successfully than most other indigenous groups. The Mapuche developed a semi-nomadic lifestyle that combined seasonal migration with permanent settlements. They were skilled in both hunting and rudimentary agriculture, cultivating potatoes and other crops in the more favorable valleys, while maintaining their mobility to follow game animals and avoid conflicts. Their social organization was based on family groups called lof, which were united into larger territorial groups called Aylarahu when facing external threats. The material culture of the Mapuche included sophisticated textile traditions, metalworking skills, and architectural techniques adapted to their environment. Their silver work, in particular, became renowned throughout the region, with Mapuche silversmiths creating ornaments and functional objects of great beauty and cultural significance. Their textiles, featuring distinctive patterns and symbolic motifs, conveyed complex cultural information about tribal identity, social status, and spiritual beliefs. The spiritual beliefs of the Mapuche were centered on their relationship with the natural world. They believed in a complex pantheon of spirits associated with different aspects of the landscape, mountain spirits, water spirits, and forest spirits that required proper respect and ritual attention. Their religious practices included elaborate ceremonies, shamanic healing traditions, and communal rituals that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. The Tehuelche peoples, who occupied much of central and southern Patagonia, developed cultural adaptations specifically suited to the open steppes and harsh climate of their region. They were primarily nomadic hunters who followed the seasonal migrations of guanaco herds across vast distances. Their knowledge of Patagonian geography was encyclopedic. They knew every water source, every sheltered valley, every seasonal variation in resources across thousands of square kilometers of seemingly uniform landscape. The social organization of the Tehuelche was based on small, highly mobile bands that could respond quickly to changes in resource availability. Their material culture emphasized portability and durability, with tools, weapons, and household items designed to withstand the rigors of constant travel across rough terrain. Despite their nomadic lifestyle, the Tehuelche maintained sophisticated cultural traditions, including oral literature, artistic expression, and complex systems of social relationships that connected bands across enormous territories. The economic systems developed by various indigenous peoples of Argentina reflected their sophisticated understanding of their respective environments. In the northwest, the agricultural peoples developed complex trade networks that connected the high Andes with the lowland regions, exchanging agricultural products for metal goods, textiles, and other manufactured items. These trade routes, some of which extended for hundreds of kilometers, created economic relationships that crossed tribal boundaries and connected diverse cultural groups. In the Pampas region, indigenous peoples developed different economic strategies based on the grassland environment. They hunted rheas, guanacos, and other grassland animals, gathered wild plants and roots, and developed seasonal migration patterns that took advantage of resource variations across the vast plains. Their economic activities created knowledge systems that would later prove invaluable to European settlers attempting to adapt to the pampa environment. The riverine peoples of the northeast developed economic systems that combined agriculture, fishing, and hunting in sustainable patterns that supported relatively large populations. Their agricultural techniques, particularly their methods of cultivating crops in flood-prone areas, represented sophisticated environmental management that maximized productivity while minimizing risk. The cultural achievements of Argentina's indigenous peoples extended beyond purely practical adaptations to include sophisticated artistic traditions, complex mythologies, and rich oral literatures. The rock art of Patagonia, the ceramics and textiles of the Northwest, the ceremonial objects of the riverine peoples, and the oral traditions of all these groups represent cultural achievements of remarkable sophistication and beauty. These artistic and intellectual traditions serve not only aesthetic functions, but also practical purposes in maintaining cultural coherence and transmitting essential knowledge across generations. The geometric patterns in Daiguita ceramics, for example, conveyed information about tribal identity, religious beliefs, and seasonal cycles. The oral traditions of the Mapuche included not only entertainment and spiritual instruction, but also practical knowledge about geography, weather patterns, and resource management. The linguistic diversity of pre-Columbian Argentina reflected the cultural diversity of its indigenous peoples. Dozens of distinct languages and dialects were spoken across the territory, each adapted to the specific needs and experiences of its speakers. These languages encoded sophisticated knowledge about local environments, cultural practices, and social relationships that had been developed over centuries of experience. As we consider the rich tapestry of indigenous cultures that flourished in pre-Columbian Argentina, it is important to recognize that these were not primitive or simple societies, but rather sophisticated civilizations that had achieved remarkable adaptations to their respective environments. Their technological innovations, social organizations, artistic achievements, and environmental knowledge represented the culmination of thousands of years of human experience and cultural development. The legacy of these indigenous civilizations extends far beyond the historical period we are examining. Their agricultural techniques, place names, cultural practices, and genetic heritage continue to influence modern Argentina in countless ways. The mate tradition inherited from the Guarani, the agricultural knowledge of the Northwest peoples, the geographic understanding of the Patagonian groups, and the artistic traditions of all these cultures have become integral parts of Argentine identity. Understanding these pre-Columbian civilizations provides essential context for comprehending the dramatic changes that would occur with European contact. The indigenous peoples of Argentina were not passive recipients of European influence, but rather active participants in the complex processes of cultural contact, conflict, and adaptation that would shape the colonial period and beyond. Their sophisticated knowledge of local environments, their established trade networks, and their complex social organizations would all play crucial roles in determining how European colonization would unfold across this vast and diverse territory. Chapter 3: Colonial Period and Spanish Rule. The year 1536 marks a pivotal moment in the history of the Rio de la Plata region, when Spanish conquistador Pedro de Mendoza established the first European settlement on the southern bank of the great river that would give its name to the entire region. This moment represents not merely the beginning of Spanish colonial rule, but the collision of two worlds, the sophisticated indigenous civilizations we have explored, and the expanding Spanish Empire that was transforming the Americas through conquest, settlement, and cultural transformation. Pedro de Mendoza's expedition arrived in the Rio de la Plata with dreams of gold and silver that had been inspired by the spectacular conquests of Mexico and Peru. The very name Rio de la Plata, River of Silver, reflected these hopes, as Spanish explorers believed they had found another pathway to the mineral wealth that had made Cortés and Pizarro legendary figures in Spanish imperial history. However, the reality they encountered along the muddy banks of the Rio de la Plata was far different from their golden dreams. The first settlement, which Mendoza named Nuestra Señora Santa Maria del Buen Aire, Our Lady St. Mary of the Good Air, in honor of the patron saint of sailors, faced immediate challenges that would characterize much of early Spanish colonization in the region. Unlike Mexico or Peru, where Spanish conquistadors encountered centralized indigenous empires with accumulated wealth and established agricultural systems, the Rio de la Plata region presented a different set of circumstances that required different strategies for successful colonization. The Querandí and other indigenous peoples of the Pampas region were not passive victims of Spanish expansion. They possessed sophisticated knowledge of their environment, well-developed military capabilities, and social organizations that could respond effectively to external threats. When Spanish demands for food and tribute exceeded what the indigenous peoples were willing or able to provide, conflict became inevitable. The indigenous response to Spanish colonization attempts included both military resistance and strategic withdrawal into the vast interior regions where European technology and tactics were less effective. The failure of Mendoza's first Buenos Aires settlement in 1539 represents one of the most dramatic episodes in early Argentine colonial history. Faced with constant warfare with indigenous peoples, inadequate food supplies, and internal conflicts among the Spanish colonists themselves, the settlement became unsustainable. The decision to abandon Buenos Aires and retreat upriver to Asunción marked not a defeat for Spanish colonization, but rather a strategic recognition that successful settlement required different approaches and better understanding of local conditions. The Spanish colonial strategy that emerged from these early failures was based on a more gradual and systematic approach to territorial occupation. Rather than attempting to establish major settlements immediately along the Atlantic coast, Spanish colonizers focused first on establishing secure bases in the interior regions where they could develop sustainable relationships with indigenous peoples and build the economic foundations necessary for long-term colonial success. The city of Santiago del Estero, founded in 1553 by Francisco de Aguirre, represents the first permanent Spanish settlement in what is now Argentina. Located in the northwestern region where indigenous peoples had already developed sophisticated agricultural systems, Santiago del Estero could take advantage of existing food production and establish trade networks. The choice of location reflected a more sophisticated understanding of the geographic and cultural factors that would determine colonial success. The establishment of Santiago del Estero marked the beginning of a systematic Spanish advance across the Argentine territory that would continue for the next 2 centuries. This expansion followed geographic and strategic logic, with new settlements established at key river crossings, mountain passes, and fertile valleys that could support agricultural development and serve as bases for further territorial expansion. Each new settlement built upon the lessons learned from previous colonization efforts, creating an increasingly effective system of territorial control and economic development. The founding of Córdoba in 1573 by Jerónimo Luis de Cabrera exemplifies this systematic approach to colonial expansion. Located at the intersection of major trade routes connecting the silver mines of Potosí with the Atlantic coast, Córdoba's geographic position made it a natural center for commercial activity and territorial administration. The city's establishment in the fertile valleys of the Sierras de Córdoba also provided access to agricultural land and indigenous labor that could support a substantial Spanish population. Córdoba's development as a colonial center illustrates the evolution of Spanish administrative and economic systems in Argentina. The city became home to one of the earliest universities in South America, founded by the Jesuits in 1613, making it a center of education and intellectual life that would influence colonial culture throughout the region. The university represented not only Spanish commitment to establishing permanent civilizational institutions in the New World, but also the recognition that successful colonization required the development of local intellectual and administrative capacity. The Jesuit missions represent one of the most distinctive and influential aspects of Spanish colonization in northeastern Argentina. Beginning in the early 17th century, Jesuit missionaries established a network of missions among the Guarani peoples that created unique hybrid societies combining indigenous and European elements. These missions, known as reducciones, represented an alternative model of colonization that emphasized religious conversion and cultural transformation rather than direct economic exploitation. The Jesuit missions achieved remarkable success in creating self-sustaining communities that combined indigenous agricultural techniques with European technology and organizational methods. The missions developed sophisticated agricultural systems that included not only traditional crops such as corn and sweet potatoes, but also European introductions such as cattle, horses, and wheat. The combination of indigenous environmental knowledge with European agricultural technology created productive systems that supported substantial populations and generated surplus production for trade with other colonial settlements. The social organization of the Jesuit missions represented a fascinating experiment in cultural synthesis. The missions maintained indigenous languages and many traditional cultural practices while introducing European educational systems, religious beliefs, and economic organizations. The result was a unique colonial society that preserved important elements of indigenous culture while adapting to the realities of Spanish colonial rule. The economic success of the Jesuit missions was built upon their ability to combine indigenous labor and European management in productive enterprises that served both local needs and regional markets. The missions became major producers of yerba mate, a traditional indigenous beverage that became one of the most important trade commodities in the colonial economy of the Rio de la Plata region. They also developed sophisticated crafts industries, including textile production, woodworking, and metalworking, that combined indigenous skills with European techniques. The architectural achievements of the Jesuit missions, including churches, workshops, and residential buildings, represent some of the finest examples of colonial architecture in South America. The mission buildings combined European architectural principles with indigenous construction techniques and decorative traditions, creating a distinctive style that reflected the cultural synthesis achieved by these unique communities. The ruins of missions such as San Ignacio Mini, Santa Ana, and Nuestra Señora de Loreto continue to provide testimony to the remarkable achievements of this colonial experiment. The expulsion of the Jesuits from Spanish territories in 1767 marked the end of one of the most successful experiments in colonial cultural synthesis. The missions were transferred to secular administration, but without Jesuit leadership and organizational expertise, many of the communities gradually dissolved. The indigenous peoples who had lived in the missions faced difficult choices between integration into Spanish colonial society, return to traditional lifestyles, or migration to areas beyond Spanish control. While the Jesuit missions were creating their unique societies in the northeast, other forms of colonial development were transforming the rest of Argentine territory. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists rights to indigenous labor and tribute, became the foundation of colonial economic development in many regions. This system, while providing Spanish colonists with access to labor and resources, also created complex relationships between Spanish and indigenous communities that would shape colonial society for generations. The development of cattle ranching in the Pampas region represents one of the most significant economic transformations of the colonial period. Spanish colonists introduced cattle, horses, and sheep to the vast grasslands of the Pampas, creating the foundation for what would become one of Argentina's most important economic activities. The adaptation of European livestock to South American conditions was remarkably successful, with herds growing rapidly in the favorable climate and abundant pastures of the Pampas. The cultural impact of cattle ranching extended far beyond its economic importance. The development of gaucho culture, with its distinctive horseback lifestyle, represented a unique synthesis of Spanish, indigenous, and African cultural elements adapted to the specific conditions of life on the Pampas. The gaucho became not only an economic necessity for managing vast herds across enormous distances, but also a cultural symbol that would profoundly influence Argentine national identity. The refounding of Buenos Aires in 1580 by Juan de Garay represents one of the most significant moments in Argentine colonial history. Unlike the failed first attempt, the second Buenos Aires was established with better understanding of local conditions, more adequate supplies, and clearer strategic objectives. The city's location at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata provided access to the river systems that drained much of the South American interior, making it a natural center for trade and transportation. The development of Buenos Aires as a colonial port city was constrained by Spanish mercantile policies that restricted trade to authorized routes and partners. The Spanish colonial system required that goods from the Rio de la Plata region travel overland to Lima and then by sea to Spain, a circuitous route that made legal trade expensive and inefficient. These restrictions encouraged the development of contraband trade that brought Buenos Aires into direct contact with Portuguese, Dutch, and British merchants seeking access to South American markets. The contraband trade that flourished in colonial Buenos Aires represented more than simple economic opportunism. It reflected the geographic reality that Buenos Aires was naturally oriented toward Atlantic trade rather than Pacific routes to Spain. The city's position at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata made it an ideal entrepot for goods flowing between the South American interior and European markets. This geographic advantage would eventually force changes in Spanish colonial policy and contribute to Buenos Aires' emergence as the dominant city of the region. The establishment of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata in 1776 represents the Spanish Empire's recognition of the growing importance of the Rio de la Plata region and the need for more effective administration of this vast territory. The creation of the new Viceroyalty, with Buenos Aires as its capital, marked a fundamental shift in Spanish colonial policy that acknowledged the economic and strategic significance of the Atlantic-oriented regions of South America. The new Viceroyalty encompassed not only present-day Argentina, but also Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, creating one of the largest administrative units in the Spanish Empire. This territorial organization reflected both the geographic unity of the Rio de la Plata river system and the economic relationships that connected the silver mines of Potosí with the port of Buenos Aires. The Viceroyalty's establishment also represented Spanish efforts to counter Portuguese expansion from Brazil and British commercial pressure in the South Atlantic. The administrative reforms that accompanied the creation of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata included significant changes in trade policy that would transform the economic development of the region. The establishment of free trade within the Spanish Empire, meaning trade between Spanish colonies and Spain without the previous restrictions, allowed Buenos Aires to develop direct commercial relationships with Spanish and other European markets. This policy change unleashed the economic potential that had been constrained by earlier mercantile restrictions. The social structure of colonial Argentine society reflected the complex interactions between Spanish, indigenous, and African populations that characterized most Spanish-American colonies. At the top of the social hierarchy were the peninsulares, Spanish-born colonists who held the most important administrative and ecclesiastical positions. Below them were the criollos, American-born descendants of Spanish colonists, who formed the backbone of colonial society but were often excluded from the highest positions of authority. The indigenous population of colonial Argentina occupied various positions within the colonial social structure, depending on their relationship to Spanish colonial institutions. Those who lived in Spanish towns or worked on Spanish estates were subject to colonial law and Catholic religious instruction, but often maintained elements of their traditional culture. Indigenous peoples who remained in mission communities enjoyed greater cultural autonomy, but were still subject to Spanish colonial authority. Those who lived beyond Spanish control maintained their traditional lifestyles but faced constant pressure from expanding colonial settlement. The African presence in colonial Argentina, while smaller than in other regions of Spanish America, was nevertheless significant in certain areas and occupations. Enslaved Africans were brought to Argentina primarily through the port of Buenos Aires, which served as a distribution center for much of southern South America. They worked in urban households, artisan shops, and rural estates, contributing their skills and cultural traditions to the developing colonial society. The mestizo population, resulting from unions between Spanish and indigenous peoples, formed an increasingly important segment of colonial society. Mestizos often served as intermediaries between Spanish and indigenous communities, possessing cultural knowledge that made them valuable as translators, traders, and cultural brokers. Their position in colonial society was ambiguous, neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous, but their numbers and importance grew throughout the colonial period. Religious life in colonial Argentina was dominated by the Catholic Church, which served not only spiritual functions but also played crucial roles in education, social services, and cultural development. The establishment of churches, convents, and monasteries in major colonial cities created centers of learning and artistic production that contributed significantly to colonial culture. The Baroque architecture of colonial churches, with their elaborate decorations and artistic programs, represented some of the finest artistic achievements of the colonial period. The Catholic Church's missionary activities among indigenous populations represented one of the most significant cultural transformations of the colonial period. The conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity involved not only changes in religious beliefs, but also modifications in social organization, economic practices, and cultural expression. The process was complex and often incomplete, with many indigenous communities developing syncretic religious practices that combined Christian and traditional elements. Educational institutions in colonial Argentina were primarily religious in character, with the Jesuits, Franciscans, and other religious orders taking leading roles in establishing schools and universities. The University of Córdoba, founded in 1613, became one of the most important centers of higher learning in South America, training generations of lawyers, doctors, and theologians who would play crucial roles in colonial and later national development. The economic development of colonial Argentina was based primarily on agricultural production, livestock ranching, and trade in raw materials. The different regions of the colony specialized in different products according to their geographic advantages and resource endowments. The Northwest produced textiles, wine, and agricultural products for regional markets. The Northeast supplied yerba mate, tobacco, and hides. The Pampas region developed as a center of cattle and horse ranching that would become increasingly important as colonial trade expanded. Mining activities in colonial Argentina never achieved the spectacular success of Peru or Mexico, but nevertheless contributed to colonial economic development. The silver mines of Potosí, while located in present-day Bolivia, created demand for Argentine products and services that stimulated economic development throughout the Rio de la Plata region. Lesser mining activities within present-day Argentina, including gold mining in the northwest and various other mineral extractions, provided additional economic opportunities for colonial entrepreneurs. The development of inter-regional trade networks within the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata created economic relationships that connected distant regions and diverse populations. Mule trains carried goods between the silver mines of Bolivia and the port of Buenos Aires, creating a commercial route that passed through multiple regions of present-day Argentina. These trade networks not only moved goods, but also facilitated the exchange of ideas, cultural practices, and technological innovations. The contraband trade that flourished throughout the colonial period represented both a challenge to Spanish mercantile policy and a reflection of the natural economic relationships that connected Buenos Aires with Atlantic commercial networks. Portuguese, Dutch, and British merchants established relationships with Buenos Aires traders that brought European manufactured goods to the Rio de la Plata, in exchange for hides, tallow, and silver. This illegal but extensive trade created economic relationships that would influence post-independence development. The cultural development of colonial Argentina reflected the complex interactions between European, indigenous, and African traditions that characterized colonial society. Colonial art and architecture combined European styles with indigenous and African decorative elements, creating distinctive regional variations that reflected local materials, skills, and aesthetic preferences. The Baroque churches of colonial cities, the domestic architecture of colonial towns, and the decorative arts produced in colonial workshops all reflect this cultural synthesis. Literary and intellectual development in colonial Argentina was constrained by Spanish restrictions on printing and education, but nevertheless produced important works that reflected colonial experience and concerns. The writings of colonial administrators, missionaries, and travelers provide valuable insights into colonial society and culture. The development of local historical traditions, legal practices, and educational methods contributed to the emergence of distinctive colonial intellectual traditions. The gradual development of Creole identity represents one of the most significant cultural transformations of the colonial period. Creoles, while legally Spanish, developed distinct perspectives on their American homeland that distinguished them from peninsular Spaniards. Their attachment to American landscapes, their involvement in local economic activities, and their development of local cultural traditions created the foundation for the independence movements that would transform the region in the early 19th century. As the 18th century progressed, various factors began to create tensions within the colonial system that would ultimately contribute to the independence movements. Economic growth increased Creole confidence and ambitions, while Spanish administrative policies often failed to accommodate changing colonial circumstances. The Bourbon reforms of the late 18th century, while intended to strengthen Spanish colonial control, often created new conflicts between imperial and local interests. The British invasions of Buenos Aires in 1806 and 1807 represent a watershed moment in late colonial history. These military attacks, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated both Spanish military weakness and Creole capacity for self-defense. The successful defense of Buenos Aires by local militias under the leadership of Santiago de Liniers created a sense of Creole military capability and political confidence that would influence subsequent political developments. The colonial period in Argentina represents more than simply a prelude to independence. It was a formative era that created the institutional, economic, social, and cultural foundations upon which the modern nation would be built. The colonial cities established patterns of urban development that continue to influence Argentine society. The economic activities developed during the colonial period created regional specializations that would shape national economic development. The cultural synthesis achieved during 3 centuries of colonial development created the distinctive Argentine identity that would find expression in the independence period and beyond. Understanding the colonial period is essential for comprehending not only how Spanish rule shaped Argentine development, but also how the diverse peoples of Argentina, Spanish, indigenous, African, and mixed populations, created the complex society that would seek independence in the early 19th century. The colonial period was not simply a time of Spanish domination, but rather an era of cultural creation in which new societies, new identities, and new possibilities emerged from the encounter between different peoples and cultures in the distinctive geographic setting of Argentina. Chapter 4: Path to Independence and Nation Building. The dawn of the 19th century found the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata at a crossroads of history, where the accumulated tensions of 3 centuries of colonial development would converge with the revolutionary currents sweeping through the Atlantic world. The path from Spanish colonial dependency to independent nationhood would prove to be neither straight nor simple, involving decades of warfare, political experimentation, and social transformation that would ultimately forge the Argentine Republic from the diverse regions and peoples we have explored. The catalyst for revolutionary change came not from within the colonies themselves, but from the dramatic events unfolding in Europe as Napoleon's armies swept across the Iberian Peninsula. The French invasion of Spain in 1808 and the subsequent abdication of King Ferdinand VII created a crisis of legitimacy throughout the Spanish Empire that would provide the opening for American independence movements. When news reached Buenos Aires that the Spanish government had effectively collapsed, it created both an opportunity and a necessity for local political action. The May Revolution of 1810 represents the foundational moment of Argentine independence, though its participants could hardly have imagined the long and complex process that would ultimately lead to national consolidation. On May 25, 1810, a Cabildo Abierto, an open town council meeting in Buenos Aires, voted to establish the Primera Junta, the first autonomous government in the Rio de la Plata region. This moment marked not only the beginning of Argentine independence, but also the emergence of Buenos Aires as the political center of the emerging nation. The composition of the Primera Junta reflected the Creole leadership that would guide the independence process. Cornelio Saavedra, a military officer who had distinguished himself during the British invasions, served as president, while Mariano Moreno, a lawyer and political theorist influenced by Enlightenment ideas, became secretary. The junta also included representatives from different sectors of Buenos Aires society, including merchants, lawyers, and military officers, but notably excluded both Peninsular Spaniards and indigenous peoples from meaningful participation. The political philosophy underlying the May Revolution drew heavily from Enlightenment political theory, particularly the concepts of popular sovereignty and natural rights that had inspired the American and French revolutions. Moreno and other revolutionary intellectuals had access to the works of Rousseau, Montesquieu, and other European political theorists, and they sought to apply these ideas to the specific circumstances of the Rio de la Plata region. However, the translation of theoretical concepts into practical governance would prove to be extraordinarily challenging. The initial revolutionary government faced immediate challenges that would characterize much of the independence period. The interior regions of the Viceroyalty, Paraguay, Bolivia, and much of present-day Argentina did not automatically accept the authority of the Buenos Aires junta. Many interior cities and regions had their own political traditions and economic interests that conflicted with Buenos Aires leadership. The result was not a unified independence movement, but rather a complex series of regional conflicts and negotiations that would continue for decades. The military dimension of the independence struggle required the creation of revolutionary armies capable of fighting both Spanish loyalist forces and regional rivals. The Army of the North, under various commanders including Manuel Belgrano and later José de San Martín, was tasked with securing the northern regions and preventing Spanish reconquest from the stronghold of Peru. These military campaigns involved not only conventional warfare, but also complex negotiations with indigenous peoples, regional caudillos, and local populations whose loyalties were often divided or uncertain. Manuel Belgrano emerged as one of the most significant military and political leaders of the early independence period. A lawyer and economist by training, Belgrano reluctantly accepted military commands that would make him one of Argentina's most celebrated heroes. His victories at the battles of Tucumán and Salta in 1812 and 1813 respectively demonstrated that revolutionary forces could successfully resist Spanish military power. Perhaps more importantly, Belgrano's creation of the Argentine flag provided a powerful symbol of emerging national identity. The flag that Belgrano created along the banks of the Paraná River in 1812 represented more than military insignia. It embodied the aspiration for a distinct national identity separate from Spanish colonial symbols. The choice of blue and white colors, possibly inspired by the colors worn by supporters of the May Revolution, created a visual representation of Argentine independence that could inspire loyalty and unity among diverse regional populations. The flag's adoption and gradual acceptance throughout the revolutionary territories marked an important step in the creation of national consciousness. José de San Martin's arrival in Buenos Aires in 1812 marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary military and political careers in South American history. San Martin, who had served in the Spanish army fighting against Napoleon in Europe, brought professional military training and strategic vision that would prove crucial to the success of the independence movement. His understanding that Argentine independence could not be secured without the liberation of Peru led him to conceive and execute one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. The creation of the Army of the Andes represents San Martin's masterpiece of military organization and strategic planning, recognizing that direct assault on Spanish forces in Peru through the northern route had repeatedly failed. San Martin proposed the seemingly impossible alternative of crossing the Andes Mountains to attack Spanish forces in Chile, then proceeding by sea to Peru. This strategy required not only military skill but also diplomatic negotiations with Chilean revolutionaries and complex logistical planning to support an army crossing one of the world's most formidable mountain barriers. The crossing of the Andes in 1817 stands as one of the great military achievements of the independence era. San Martin's army, of approximately 5,000 men, along with artillery, supplies, and thousands of mules and horses, successfully traversed multiple mountain passes in a coordinated operation that brought them into Chile in position to surprise Spanish loyalist forces. The subsequent victory at the Battle of Chacabuco opened the path to Chilean liberation and demonstrated the viability of San Martin's strategic vision. San Martin's success in Chile and subsequent campaigns in Peru established him as one of the great liberators of South America, alongside Simón Bolívar. However, his achievements came at enormous personal cost and required sacrifices that would ultimately lead to his voluntary exile from the countries he had helped to liberate. The story of San Martin reflects both the heroic dimension of the independence struggle and the personal costs borne by those who dedicated their lives to the cause of American freedom. While San Martin was conducting his campaigns in Chile and Peru, the political situation within the emerging Argentine nation was becoming increasingly complex and contentious. The absence of strong central authority, combined with the diverse interests of different regions and social groups, created conditions for political fragmentation and civil conflict that would plague Argentina for decades. The period from 1810 to 1853 would be characterized by alternating cycles of attempted centralization and regional rebellion. The constitutional efforts of the independence period reflect the challenge of creating stable political institutions in a society that lacked experience with democratic governance. The Constitution of 1819, drafted by a Constituent Congress meeting in Tucumán, attempted to establish a centralized republic with strong executive authority. However, this constitution was never effectively implemented, as regional leaders rejected what they perceived as Buenos Aires' domination over the interior provinces. The emergence of caudillismo represents one of the most significant political developments of the post-independence period. Caudillos were regional strongmen who combined military leadership with political authority, often governing their territories with little regard for constitutional niceties or central authority. While often depicted as obstacles to national progress, caudillos actually served important functions in providing local leadership and maintaining order during a period when formal political institutions were weak or non-existent. Juan Manuel de Rosas emerged as the most powerful and controversial of the Argentine caudillos, governing Buenos Aires province from 1829 to 1852, with authority that extended far beyond his formal jurisdiction. Rosas represented both the strengths and weaknesses of caudillo rule. He provided stability and effective governance for Buenos Aires, but his methods were often dictatorial, and his relationship with other provinces was frequently conflictual. His long reign illustrates both the appeal of strong leadership during turbulent times and the dangers of personalized political power. The economic foundations of the emerging Argentine nation were being transformed during the independence and early national periods by changes in international trade patterns and domestic production systems. The end of Spanish colonial restrictions opened Argentine markets to direct trade with Britain, France, and other European nations, creating new opportunities for export-oriented production. The expansion of cattle ranching in the Pampas region, stimulated by growing European demand for hides and salted meat, became increasingly important to the national economy. The development of estancias, large cattle ranches, represented both economic opportunity and social transformation in the Pampas region. These extensive properties, often encompassing thousands of hectares, became the foundation of a new rural social structure based on large-scale livestock production for export markets. The estancia system created a rural aristocracy of landowners who would play crucial roles in Argentine politics for generations, while also providing employment for the gauchos whose skills were essential for managing vast herds across enormous distances. The gaucho culture that flourished during the early national period represents one of Argentina's most distinctive cultural contributions. These horsemen of the Pampas developed skills, traditions, and values adapted to the specific conditions of life on the vast grasslands. Their mastery of horsemanship, their knowledge of cattle management, and their adaptation to the rhythms of rural life created a cultural archetype that would profoundly influence Argentine national identity. The gaucho became not only an economic necessity, but also a cultural symbol representing freedom, individualism, and connection to the land. The tension between Buenos Aires and the interior provinces, known as the conflict between unitarios and federales, dominated Argentine politics throughout the first half of the 19th century. Unitarios favored centralized government with Buenos Aires as the undisputed capital, while federales advocated for provincial autonomy and decentralized political authority. This conflict reflected not only different political philosophies, but also different economic interests and regional identities that had developed during the colonial period. The Battle of Caseros in 1852 marked the end of Rosas's long dominance and opened the possibility for national reorganization under new leadership. The victory of Justo José de Urquiza, governor of Entre Rios province, over Rosas's forces represented not only a military defeat, but also a political transformation that would make possible the constitutional settlement that had eluded Argentina for more than 4 decades. Urquiza's triumph demonstrated that effective opposition to Buenos Aires' hegemony was possible and created the conditions for negotiating a new constitutional arrangement. The Constitution of 1853, drafted by a constitutional convention meeting in Santa Fe, represents the successful culmination of decades of political experimentation and conflict. This constitution, which remains the fundamental law of Argentina with modifications, created a federal republic that balanced the competing demands of Buenos Aires and the interior provinces. The constitutional settlement acknowledged Buenos Aires' economic and political importance while guaranteeing provincial autonomy and representation in the national government. The constitutional framework established in 1853 drew inspiration from the United States Constitution, but adapted its provisions to Argentine circumstances and traditions. The creation of a federal system with both national and provincial authorities reflected the reality that Argentina was too large and diverse to be governed effectively from a single center, while the establishment of strong executive authority acknowledged the need for effective national leadership. The Constitution also included provisions for civil liberties, economic development, and immigration that reflected the liberal ideology of its framers. The secession of Buenos Aires from the Argentine Confederation between 1853 and 1861 represents the final chapter in the long struggle between centralist and federalist forces. Buenos Aires leaders, reluctant to surrender their province's advantages to a national government they could not control, chose temporary separation rather than acceptance of the new constitutional order. This period of parallel governments, the Argentine Confederation with its capital in Paraná, and the state of Buenos Aires maintaining its separate existence, demonstrated both the persistence of regional conflicts and the ultimate necessity of national unity. The Battle of Pavón in 1861 and the subsequent reunification of Buenos Aires with the Argentine Confederation under the leadership of Bartolomé Mitre marked the final resolution of the constitutional crisis that had plagued Argentina since independence. Mitre's presidency from 1862 to 1868 established the precedents and institutions that would guide Argentina's transformation from a fragmented collection of provinces into a modern nation-state. The War of the Triple Alliance, fought between 1864 and 1870 against Paraguay, represents Argentina's first major international conflict as a unified nation. This devastating war, in which Argentina allied with Brazil and Uruguay against Paraguay, had profound consequences for all participants. For Argentina, the war provided an opportunity to demonstrate national unity and military capability, but it also revealed the costs and complexities of international involvement. The war's outcome established Argentina as a significant power in the Rio de la Plata region, while contributing to Paraguay's demographic and economic devastation. The immigration policies established during the constitutional period reflect the liberal vision of Argentina's founders and their belief that European immigration would contribute to national development and progress. The Constitution of 1853 explicitly encouraged immigration, and subsequent legislation provided incentives for Europeans to settle in Argentina. This policy decision would have profound consequences for Argentine society, ultimately bringing millions of immigrants who would transform the nation's demographic, cultural, and economic characteristics. The expansion of education during the early national period represents another aspect of the liberal project of national construction. Leaders such as Domingo Faustino Sarmiento advocated for public education as essential for creating an informed citizenry capable of democratic governance. Sarmiento's travels to Europe and the United States to study educational systems, and his subsequent efforts to establish public schools throughout Argentina, reflected the belief that education was crucial for national progress and social development. The development of transportation and communication infrastructure during the mid-19th century created the physical foundations for national integration. The construction of railways connecting Buenos Aires with interior provinces, the improvement of river navigation on the Paraná and Uruguay systems, and the establishment of telegraph communications began to overcome the geographic obstacles that had previously isolated different regions from each other. These infrastructure investments, often financed by foreign capital and built by European engineers, created the conditions for economic integration and political consolidation. The cultural developments of the early national period reflect the complex process of creating a distinctive Argentine identity from the diverse regional and ethnic elements that comprised the nation. The emergence of national literature, music, and artistic traditions drew from both European models and local experiences, creating cultural expressions that were recognizably Argentine while remaining connected to broader American and European traditions. Writers such as Esteban Echeverría and José Mármol began to create literature that reflected distinctively Argentine themes and concerns. The resolution of the indigenous question represents one of the most problematic aspects of early national development. The expansion of agricultural and ranching activities into territories previously occupied by indigenous peoples created conflicts that the national government resolved primarily through military force. The campaigns against indigenous peoples, while opening new lands for development, also represented the destruction of cultures and societies that had inhabited Argentina for thousands of years. The transformation of Argentina from colonial dependency through revolutionary struggle to constitutional nationhood represents one of the most complex and dramatic examples of nation-building in Latin American history. The process involved not only military campaigns and political negotiations, but also profound social and cultural transformations that created new forms of identity and belonging. The Argentina that emerged from this process was neither simply Spanish nor indigenous nor European, but rather a new creation that combined elements from all these sources in distinctive and original ways. The constitutional settlement of the 1850s provided the framework within which Argentina would develop into a modern nation, but the work of nation-building was far from complete. The institutions, traditions, and identities created during the independence and early national periods would continue to evolve and develop as Argentina faced new challenges and opportunities in the rapidly changing world of the late 19th century. The foundation had been laid, but the construction of the modern Argentine nation would continue for generations to come. Chapter 5: Modern Argentina. The second half of the 19th century witnessed Argentina's transformation from a sparsely populated, politically fragmented collection of provinces into one of the world's most prosperous and rapidly growing nations. This remarkable metamorphosis was driven by a confluence of factors: massive European immigration, revolutionary changes in transportation and communication, the integration of Argentina into the global economy, and the development of political institutions capable of governing a modern nation-state. The Argentina that emerged from this transformation would become a beacon of opportunity in the New World and a major player on the global stage. The great wave of European immigration that began in the 1870s and continued through the 1920s represents one of the most significant demographic transformations in human history. Between 1870 and 1930, approximately 6 million Europeans immigrated to Argentina, fundamentally altering the nation's population composition, cultural characteristics, and economic potential. This massive movement of people across the Atlantic was driven by both push and pull factors that created one of history's great migration streams. The conditions in Europe that encouraged emigration were complex and varied by region and time period. Economic hardship, particularly in rural areas affected by agricultural modernization and population growth, created pressures that made emigration attractive to millions of Europeans. Political upheavals, including wars, revolutions, and persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, provided additional motivations for leaving Europe. The unification of Italy and Germany created particular dislocations that sent thousands of immigrants across the Atlantic seeking new opportunities. Argentina's appeal to European immigrants was based on both economic opportunities and government policies designed to attract settlers. The Constitution of 1853 explicitly encouraged immigration, and subsequent governments implemented policies that provided free or subsidized passage, land grants, and other incentives for European settlement. The promise of economic opportunity in a land-rich, labor-poor country proved irresistible to millions of Europeans seeking to escape poverty and build better lives for their families. The majority of immigrants came from Italy and Spain, but significant numbers also arrived from Germany, France, Poland, Russia, Syria, Lebanon, and other countries. Each group brought distinctive cultural traditions, skills, and perspectives that would contribute to the emerging Argentine identity. The Italians, who comprised the largest single group, brought agricultural expertise, urban skills, and cultural traditions that would profoundly influence Argentine food, language, and customs. Spanish immigrants contributed not only their language and cultural traditions, but also their commercial and administrative experience. The process of immigration was facilitated by revolutionary changes in ocean transportation that made transatlantic travel faster, safer, and more affordable. The development of steamship services connecting European ports with Buenos Aires reduced travel time from months to weeks and made immigration accessible to people of modest means. The Argentine government established immigration reception facilities in Buenos Aires, including the famous Hotel de Inmigrantes, which provided temporary housing and assistance for new arrivals. The geographic distribution of immigrants reflected both government policies and economic opportunities. While Buenos Aires received the largest number of immigrants and became one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities, significant numbers also settled in other provinces where agricultural colonies, industrial development, or commercial opportunities provided employment. The provinces of Santa Fe, Entre Rios, and Córdoba received large numbers of agricultural colonists, while Mendoza attracted immigrants to its developing wine industry. The agricultural colonization schemes implemented during this period represent one of the most successful examples of planned settlement in modern history. The Argentine government and private companies established hundreds of agricultural colonies throughout the Pampas and other suitable regions, providing immigrants with land, tools, and technical assistance needed to establish successful farms. These colonies, with names like Esperanza, San Carlos, and Reconquista, became models of agricultural development that demonstrated the potential for transforming Argentina's vast territories into productive farmland. The transformation of Argentine agriculture during the immigration period involved not only the settlement of new lands, but also revolutionary changes in farming techniques, crop varieties, and marketing systems. European immigrants brought agricultural knowledge and experience that complemented Argentina's natural advantages of fertile soil and favorable climate. The introduction of new crops, improved livestock breeds, and modern farming equipment dramatically increased agricultural productivity and made Argentina one of the world's leading food producers. The development of wheat cultivation represents perhaps the most spectacular agricultural success of this period. Argentina's wheat production increased from virtually nothing in the 1870s to making the country one of the world's largest wheat exporters by the early 20th century. This transformation was made possible by the combination of immigrant farmers with experience in cereal cultivation, the expansion of railway networks that connected farming areas with export ports, and the development of international marketing systems that could handle large-scale commodity exports. The railway revolution that accompanied the Great Immigration represented one of the most dramatic infrastructure developments in Argentine history. The construction of thousands of kilometers of railway lines, primarily financed by British capital and built by British and other European engineers, created a transportation network that connected previously isolated regions with Buenos Aires and international markets. The railway system not only facilitated the movement of agricultural products and imported goods, but also enabled the rapid movement of people that made possible the integration of immigrants into Argentine society. The expansion of the railway network followed a pattern that reflected both economic logic and political considerations. The main lines radiated outward from Buenos Aires, connecting the capital with the major cities and productive regions of the interior. Secondary lines extended the network into smaller towns and agricultural areas, creating a transportation grid that served both local needs and export requirements. The railway system became the nervous system of modern Argentina, enabling economic integration and political consolidation that would not have been possible otherwise. The port of Buenos Aires underwent massive expansion and modernization during this period to handle the dramatic increase in both immigration and trade. The construction of Puerto Madero, completed in the 1890s, created one of South America's most modern port facilities, capable of handling the large steamships that connected Argentina with European markets. The port's grain elevators, refrigeration facilities, and passenger terminals reflected Argentina's emergence as a major participant in the global economy. The development of the refrigerated meat trade represents one of the most significant innovations of this period, transforming Argentina from an exporter of hides and salted meat into a major supplier of fresh beef to European markets. The introduction of refrigeration technology in the 1880s made it possible to ship frozen and chilled beef across the Atlantic, creating a new industry that would become one of Argentina's most important export sectors. The frigorificos, meat-packing plants that processed cattle for export, became major employers and centers of industrial development. The economic boom that accompanied these developments transformed Argentina into one of the world's wealthiest nations by the early 20th century. Argentine per capita income rivaled that of the United States and exceeded that of most European countries. This prosperity was based primarily on the export of agricultural products: wheat, corn, beef, wool, and hides to rapidly growing European markets. The integration of Argentina into the global economy created unprecedented levels of wealth and opportunity that attracted continued immigration and investment. The social transformations that accompanied economic growth and mass immigration were equally dramatic. Argentine society became increasingly urban, cosmopolitan, and socially mobile as immigrants and their children sought to take advantage of expanding opportunities. The development of a substantial middle class, composed primarily of immigrants and their descendants, created new social dynamics and political pressures that would reshape Argentine society throughout the 20th century. The educational expansion that occurred during this period reflects both the liberal ideals of Argentine leaders and the practical necessities of integrating diverse immigrant populations into Argentine society. The establishment of free, compulsory public education through the Education Law of 1884 represented a commitment to creating an educated citizenry capable of democratic participation. The school system became one of the primary mechanisms for assimilating immigrants and their children into Argentine culture, while providing them with the skills needed for economic advancement. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the interaction between immigrants and existing Argentine populations created distinctive new forms of cultural expression that would become hallmarks of Argentine identity. The development of tango music and dance in the neighborhoods of Buenos Aires represents perhaps the most famous example of this cultural creativity. Tango emerged from the interaction between European musical traditions, African rhythms, and local Argentine influences, creating an art form that was both distinctly Argentine and internationally appealing. The literary renaissance that occurred during this period produced writers who captured the experience of immigration and social transformation in works that remain classics of Argentine literature. Authors such as Roberto Peyró, Leopoldo Lugones, and later Jorge Luis Borges created literature that reflected both the cosmopolitan sophistication of modern Argentina and the persistence of distinctive local traditions and concerns. Their works documented the transformation of Argentine society while contributing to the development of a distinctly Argentine cultural voice. The political evolution of Argentina during the immigration period involved the gradual expansion of democratic participation and the development of modern political parties capable of representing diverse interests and constituencies. The Radical Party, founded in 1891 under the leadership of Leandro Alem and later Hipólito Yrigoyen, emerged as the first mass political party in Argentine history, appealing particularly to middle-class voters and recent immigrants seeking political representation. The electoral reform achieved through the Sáenz-Peña Law of 1912 represents a watershed moment in Argentine political development. This legislation established universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and mandatory voting, creating the framework for competitive democratic elections. The law was named after President Roque Sáenz Peña, whose administration recognized that political modernization was necessary to accommodate the social changes created by immigration and economic development. The election of Hipólito Yrigoyen as president in 1916 marked the first time in Argentine history that political power was transferred through competitive democratic elections to a party representing middle-class and popular interests. Yrigoyen's presidency demonstrated that democratic institutions could function effectively in Argentina, while also revealing the challenges of governing a diverse society with competing interests and expectations. The economic challenges that emerged during and after World War I tested Argentina's integration into the global economy and revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities in the development model that had created such spectacular growth. The war disrupted traditional trade patterns, reduced immigration flows, and created inflationary pressures that affected different sectors of society unequally. The post-war period brought new challenges as European agricultural production recovered and competition for export markets intensified. The labor movement that developed during this period reflected both the industrial growth that accompanied immigration and the diverse political traditions that immigrants brought from Europe. Workers from Italy, Spain, and other countries brought experience with socialism, anarchism, and labor organization that influenced the development of Argentine trade unions. The growth of industrial employment in Buenos Aires and other cities created concentrations of workers who could organize effectively for better wages and working conditions. The Semana Trágica, Tragic Week of January 1919 represents one of the most significant episodes of social conflict during this period. A general strike that began in the Metalworkers' Union escalated into widespread violence that lasted several days and resulted in hundreds of casualties. The events revealed both the strength of labor organization and the fears of the established classes about social revolution. The government's response included both repression of radical labor leaders and efforts to address legitimate worker grievances through social legislation. The rise of nationalism during this period reflected both pride in Argentina's achievements and concerns about the cultural and social changes brought by massive immigration. Nationalist intellectuals and politicians argued for the importance of maintaining Argentine traditions and values while integrating immigrant populations into national life. This nationalism was generally inclusive rather than exclusive, seeking to create a synthesis of immigrant contributions with existing Argentine culture rather than rejecting foreign influences entirely. The centennial celebrations of 1910 provided an opportunity for Argentina to showcase its achievements to both domestic and international audiences. The elaborate festivities, including the inauguration of major public buildings and monuments, demonstrated Argentina's confidence in its progress and its aspirations for continued growth and development. The celebrations also provided an occasion for reflection on the distance Argentina had traveled since independence and the challenges that lay ahead. The economic prosperity of the early 20th century enabled massive investments in urban infrastructure that transformed Argentine cities, particularly Buenos Aires, into modern metropolises that rivaled European capitals in sophistication and amenities. The construction of broad avenues, public parks, theatres, museums, and other cultural institutions reflected both the wealth generated by agricultural exports and the cosmopolitan aspirations of Argentine society. The development of Buenos Aires as one of the world's great cities during this period represents one of the most remarkable examples of urban growth in modern history. The city's population grew from approximately 200,000 in 1870 to over 2 million by 1930, making it one of the largest cities in the world. This growth was accompanied by dramatic changes in architecture, urban planning, and cultural life that made Buenos Aires a symbol of New World prosperity and sophistication. The architectural heritage created during this period reflects both European influences and distinctive Argentine adaptations that created a unique urban landscape. The construction of the Teatro Colón, one of the world's great opera houses, the expansion of the University of Buenos Aires, and the development of distinctive residential neighborhoods such as Barrio Norte and San Telmo created an urban environment that expressed Argentina's cultural aspirations and economic achievements. The emergence of Argentina as a regional power during this period reflected both its economic prosperity and its growing confidence in international affairs. Argentine diplomacy played important roles in regional conflicts and international organizations, while the country's economic influence extended throughout South America through trade, investment, and immigration. Argentina's participation in international exhibitions and cultural exchanges demonstrated its desire for recognition as a modern, civilized nation. The challenges that emerged by the 1920s revealed some of the limitations and contradictions in Argentina's development model. The economy remained heavily dependent on agricultural exports and vulnerable to fluctuations in international markets and weather conditions. The political system, while democratic, struggled to accommodate the diverse interests of different regional, ethnic, and class groups. Social tensions persisted between established elites and rising middle classes, between native-born Argentines and immigrants, and between urban and rural populations. The military coup of 1930 that overthrew President Irigoyen marked the end of the optimistic era of immigration and economic growth that had characterized Argentina since the 1870s. This event signaled the beginning of a new period in Argentine history, characterized by political instability, economic uncertainty, and social conflict that would challenge many of the achievements of the previous decades. The legacy of the Great Immigration period extends far beyond the specific years when millions of Europeans crossed the Atlantic to settle in Argentina. The demographic transformation created by immigration established the ethnic and cultural foundations of modern Argentine society. The economic development that accompanied immigration created infrastructure, institutions, and productive capacity that would serve Argentina for generations. The political and social changes that resulted from immigration established patterns of democratic participation and social mobility that became integral parts of Argentine identity. The Argentina that emerged from this transformative period was fundamentally different from the nation that had achieved independence a century earlier. It was more populous, more prosperous, more urban, more democratic, and more integrated into the global community. It was also more complex, with greater social diversity, more sophisticated institutions, and more complicated relationships between different groups and regions. The synthesis of immigrant contributions with existing Argentine traditions had created a distinctive national culture that was neither purely European nor purely American, but rather something new and uniquely Argentine. Understanding this period of immigration and transformation is essential for comprehending modern Argentina because it established many of the fundamental characteristics that continue to define the nation today. The demographic patterns, economic structures, political institutions, and cultural traditions that emerged during these decades provided the foundation upon which subsequent generations would build. The dreams and achievements of the millions of immigrants who made Argentina their home created possibilities and established expectations that would influence Argentine development for generations to come. Chapter 6: Contemporary Argentina and Geographic Legacy. As the golden age of immigration and economic expansion gave way to the more turbulent decades of the 20th century, Argentina faced the challenge of adapting the institutions, expectations, and identities forged during the previous era to rapidly changing global and domestic circumstances. The story of modern Argentina is one of remarkable resilience and creativity in the face of economic crises, political upheavals, and social transformations that tested the foundations of the nation built by previous generations. Through all these changes, the geographic legacy that we explored at the beginning of our journey continued to shape Argentine development, providing both opportunities and constraints that influenced every aspect of national life. The economic crisis that began with the Great Depression of the 1930s forced Argentina to confront the limitations of its export-dependent development model. The collapse of international commodity prices and the disruption of trade relationships revealed the vulnerability of an economy based primarily on agricultural exports to European markets. This crisis prompted a fundamental re-examination of economic strategies that would lead to decades of experimentation with different approaches to development and modernization. The military government that came to power in 1930 represented not only a political rupture, but also a recognition that the liberal economic and political model of the previous decades required substantial modification. The coup that overthrew Hipólito Yrigoyen marked the beginning of a period of political instability that would characterize much of 20th century Argentine history. However, it also initiated important changes in economic policy that would have lasting consequences for Argentine development. The process of import substitution industrialization that began during the 1930s represented a fundamental shift in Argentine economic strategy. Faced with reduced access to imported manufactured goods due to the global economic crisis, Argentina began developing domestic industries to produce goods that had previously been imported. This industrialization process created new employment opportunities, particularly in Buenos Aires and other urban areas, and began to diversify an economy that had been overwhelmingly dependent on agricultural production. The social and political consequences of industrialization were as significant as its economic effects. The growth of manufacturing employment created a new industrial working class that would become a major force in Argentine politics. These workers, many of whom were recent migrants from rural areas or the children of immigrants, had different interests and perspectives than the traditional political constituencies of both the conservative oligarchy and the middle-class radical party. Their emergence as a political force would create opportunities for new forms of political leadership and organization. The rise of Juan Domingo Perón represents the most significant political development of mid-20th century Argentina and one of the most influential political phenomena in Latin American history. Perón's emergence from the military government of the 1940s to become the dominant figure in Argentine politics for decades reflected his unique ability to synthesize diverse political currents and social forces into a powerful coalition that would reshape Argentine society. Perón's political philosophy, which came to be known as Peronism or Justicialism, represented an attempt to create a distinctly Argentine approach to the challenges of modern industrial society. Drawing from various intellectual traditions, including Catholic social doctrine, European fascism, and indigenous Latin American political thought, Peronism promised to transcend the traditional conflicts between capitalism and socialism by creating a third way that would ensure both economic development and social justice. The political coalition that Perón assembled included industrial workers, lower middle-class urban residents, rural laborers, progressive military officers, nationalist intellectuals, and other groups that had been marginalized by traditional political parties. This coalition was held together not only by Perón's charismatic leadership, but also by a comprehensive program of social and economic reforms that addressed the real needs and aspirations of previously excluded sectors of Argentine society. Eva Perón, known affectionately as Evita, played a crucial role in building and maintaining the Peronist coalition, particularly among women and the urban poor. Her work in establishing labor unions for women workers, expanding access to education and healthcare, and advocating for women's suffrage made her a beloved figure whose influence extended far beyond her formal positions in government. Evita's story, from her humble origins in rural Argentina to her position as one of the most powerful women in the world, embodied the social mobility and democratic aspirations that Peronism promised to make available to all Argentines. The economic policies implemented during the first Perón administration included significant expansion of state involvement in economic development, comprehensive labor legislation that improved wages and working conditions, and massive investment in social infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities. These policies were financed primarily by the profits from agricultural exports during the favorable post-World War II period, demonstrating how Argentina's traditional geographic advantages could be mobilized to support new forms of economic and social development. The nationalization of key industries and services, including railways, telecommunications, and utilities, represented a fundamental change in the relationship between the state and the economy. These nationalizations were justified both on grounds of economic nationalism and as necessary measures to ensure that essential services served national development objectives rather than foreign profit interests. While controversial, these policies enjoyed broad popular support and became integral parts of the Peronist program. The expansion of labor rights during the Perón era created one of the most comprehensive systems of worker protections in the world. The establishment of collective bargaining rights, job security provisions, paid vacations, healthcare benefits, and retirement systems transformed the lives of Argentine workers and established expectations about the relationship between employers and employees that would influence Argentine society for generations. The political opposition to Peronism reflected both legitimate concerns about authoritarian tendencies and class-based resistance to policies that redistributed wealth and power toward previously marginalized groups. The middle class and upper class opponents of Peronism, organized in various political parties and civic organizations that criticized both the economic policies and the political methods of the Peronist government. This opposition would eventually contribute to the military coup that overthrew Perón in 1955. The military government that ruled Argentina from 1955 to 1958 attempted to reverse many Peronist policies and exclude Peronist politicians from participation in democratic politics. However, the depth of Peronist support among the working class and popular sectors made this exclusion impossible to sustain. The proscription of Peronism created a fundamental contradiction in Argentine democracy that would contribute to political instability for the next 2 decades. The period from 1958 to 1976 was characterized by alternating civilian and military governments, none of which could solve the fundamental problem of how to include the Peronist movement in democratic politics while satisfying the concerns of anti-Peronist groups. This political instability was accompanied by economic difficulties, as Argentina struggled to maintain the growth rates and social improvements of the early Peronist period in the face of changing global conditions and domestic political conflicts. The return of Perón from exile in 1973 represented an attempt to resolve the political crisis through national reconciliation and democratic inclusion. However, Perón's death in 1974 and the subsequent presidency of his widow, Isabel Perón, coincided with escalating political violence and economic crisis that would ultimately lead to the most serious breakdown of democratic governance in Argentine history. The military government that came to power in 1976 initiated what it called the process of national reorganization, a systematic attempt to transform Argentine society through the elimination of political opposition and the implementation of free market economic policies. This period, known as the Dirty War, involved massive human rights violations, including the disappearance of thousands of people suspected of political opposition, the torture and murder of political prisoners, and the systematic suppression of democratic institutions and civil liberties. The economic policies implemented by the military government represented a dramatic reversal of the statist and protectionist approaches that had characterized Argentine development since the 1930s. The liberalization of trade, the privatization of state enterprises, and the deregulation of financial markets were intended to create a more efficient and competitive economy. However, these policies also contributed to deindustrialization, unemployment, and increased inequality that would have lasting consequences for Argentine society. The Malvinas War of 1982 represented both the final crisis of military rule and a moment of intense national unity around Argentina's claim to the South Atlantic Islands, known in English as the Falklands. The military government's decision to occupy the islands was motivated primarily by domestic political considerations, as the regime sought to rally popular support in the face of economic crisis and growing opposition to authoritarian rule. The military defeat by British forces not only discredited the military government, but also created a traumatic national experience that would influence Argentine foreign policy for decades. The return to democracy in 1983, under the leadership of Raúl Alfonsín, represented a triumph of human rights advocacy and democratic values over authoritarianism and repression. Alfonsín's presidency was marked by efforts to prosecute military officers responsible for human rights violations, to establish civilian control over the military, and to rebuild democratic institutions that could function effectively in Argentine society. These efforts faced enormous challenges, including economic crisis, military resistance, and the legacy of years of political polarization and violence. The economic challenges that faced the new democratic government were compounded by the debt crisis that affected much of Latin America during the 1980s. Argentina's foreign debt, accumulated during the military government, created fiscal constraints that limited the government's ability to address social needs and economic development. The resulting economic stagnation and inflation contributed to social tensions that tested the stability of the new democratic system. The presidency of Carlos Menem from 1989 to 1999 represented another fundamental shift in Argentine economic and political development. Menem's embrace of neoliberal economic policies, including extensive privatization, deregulation, and currency stabilization, was intended to integrate Argentina into the global economy and achieve sustained economic growth. These policies initially achieved significant success in controlling inflation and attracting foreign investment, but they also contributed to unemployment, inequality, and economic vulnerability. The convertibility system, established in 1991, pegged the Argentine peso to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 exchange rate, effectively eliminating the inflation that had plagued Argentina for decades. This monetary policy provided stability that enabled economic planning and investment, but it also created rigidities that would prove unsustainable when economic conditions changed. The success of convertibility in the short term masked fundamental problems in the Argentine economy that would eventually lead to crisis. The social and cultural changes that occurred during the Menem era reflected both the opportunities created by economic stabilization and the dislocations caused by neoliberal restructuring. The expansion of consumer credit, the availability of imported goods, and the growth of service industries created new lifestyles and opportunities for middle-class Argentines. However, the decline of manufacturing employment and the weakening of labor protections also created insecurity and inequality that would have political consequences. The economic crisis that culminated in December 2001 represented one of the most severe economic collapses in modern history. The combination of fiscal crisis, currency devaluation, and banking system failure created economic chaos that wiped out savings, destroyed businesses, and threw millions of Argentines into poverty. The social upheaval that accompanied this crisis, including massive protests and the resignation of several presidents, demonstrated both the fragility of Argentina's institutional arrangements and the resilience of its democratic culture. The presidency of Nestor Kirchner from 2003 to 2007 marked the beginning of Argentina's recovery from the economic crisis and a return to more state interventionist economic policies. Kirchner's government renegotiated the foreign debt, increased public spending on social programs and infrastructure, and implemented policies designed to support domestic industry and employment. These policies achieved significant success in reducing poverty and unemployment while restoring economic growth. The continuation of Kirchnerist policies under the presidency of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner from 2007 to 2015 reflected both the political success of the government's approach and the 2004 persistence of fundamental challenges in Argentine economic development. The government's expansion of social programs, including universal child allowances and improved pension benefits, demonstrated Argentina's capacity to create inclusive social policies. However, economic problems, including inflation, currency restrictions, and fiscal deficits, revealed ongoing structural challenges. The election of Mauricio Macri in 2015 represented another shift in Argentine economic policy toward more market-oriented approaches. Macri's government eliminated currency controls, reduced export taxes, and sought to attract foreign investment through business-friendly policies. However, the return of economic crisis, including currency devaluation and recession, demonstrated the continuing difficulty of achieving sustained economic stability and growth in Argentina. The return of Peronism to power with the election of Alberto Fernandez in 2019, with Cristina Kirchner as vice president, reflected both the cyclical nature of Argentine politics and the persistence of the fundamental political divisions that have characterized the country since the 1940s. The new government faced enormous challenges, including economic recession, high inflation, massive foreign debt, and the social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout all these political and economic changes, Argentina's geography has continued to shape national development in fundamental ways. The concentration of population and economic activity in Buenos Aires and the Pampas region has created persistent regional imbalances that influence politics, economics, and social development. The wealth generated by agricultural exports from the fertile plains continues to provide Argentina with competitive advantages in global markets, while also creating dependence on commodity prices and weather conditions. The development of Argentina's energy resources, including both traditional hydrocarbon deposits and renewable energy potential, reflects the ongoing importance of geographic endowments in national development. The discovery and development of the Vaca Muerta shale formation in Neuquén province has created new opportunities for energy independence and export earnings, while the country's wind and solar resources offer possibilities for transitioning to cleaner energy sources. The environmental challenges facing contemporary Argentina reflect both global climate change and the consequences of intensive agricultural and industrial development. Deforestation in the northern provinces, soil degradation in farming areas, water pollution from mining and industrial activities, and urban environmental problems all require policy responses that balance economic development with environmental sustainability. The cultural legacy of Argentina's complex history continues to evolve as new generations seek to understand and reinterpret their inheritance. The recovery of historical memory related to the military dictatorship, the celebration of indigenous cultures previously marginalized, and the integration of more recent immigrant communities from Bolivia, Paraguay, and Peru all reflect ongoing processes of cultural development and national redefinition. Argentina's position in the contemporary global system reflects both its historical advantages and its ongoing challenges. As one of the world's largest producers of soybeans, wheat, and beef, Argentina remains an important player in global food systems. Its cultural exports, including literature, film, and music, continue to influence global culture. Its scientific and technological capabilities, including nuclear technology and biotechnology, demonstrate the country's intellectual resources. The democratic institutions that have been rebuilt and strengthened since 1983 have generally proven capable of managing political transitions and resolving conflicts peacefully. The alternation of power between different political parties and coalitions, the maintenance of press freedom and civil liberties, and the functioning of an independent judiciary all demonstrate the maturation of Argentine democracy. However, ongoing challenges, including corruption, institutional weakness, and political polarization, continue to test these achievements. The social changes that have transformed Argentina in recent decades include both improvements in areas such as education, healthcare, and gender equality, and persistent problems including poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. The expansion of access to higher education has created one of the most educated populations in Latin America, while universal healthcare systems provide basic services to all citizens. However, significant portions of the population continue to live in poverty, and social mobility has become more difficult for many Argentines. The federal system, established by the Constitution of 1853, continues to shape contemporary Argentina, with provincial governments playing important roles in education, healthcare, and economic development. The fiscal relationships between the federal government and the provinces remain sources of tension and negotiation, particularly as different regions seek to maximize their share of national resources and autonomy in local affairs. Argentina's international relationships reflect both its geographic position in South America and its global economic and cultural connections. The country plays important roles in regional organizations, including Mercosur and UNASUR, while maintaining significant relationships with the United States, Europe, and increasingly with Asia. The unresolved dispute over the Malvinas Islands continues to influence relationships with the United Kingdom and affects Argentina's participation in some international forums. The contemporary Argentine economy reflects both the continuing importance of traditional advantages and the challenges of adapting to rapidly changing global conditions. Agriculture remains central to export earnings and employment, but the sector has been transformed by technological innovations, including genetically modified crops, precision farming techniques, and improved logistics systems. Manufacturing has faced significant challenges from global competition, but continues to provide employment and serve both domestic and regional markets. The service sector has become increasingly important in the Argentine economy, reflecting both the country's high levels of education and urbanization and the growth of knowledge-intensive industries. Information technology, financial services, and creative industries have all shown significant growth potential, while tourism continues to be an important source of foreign exchange earnings. As we conclude our exploration of Argentina's remarkable journey from its geographic foundations through its indigenous civilizations, colonial transformation, independence struggles, immigration boom, and contemporary challenges, we can see how the interplay between geography and human agency has created one of the world's most distinctive and fascinating nations. The vast plains of the Pampas, the towering peaks of the Andes, the wind-swept plateaus of Patagonia, and the fertile valleys of the north have provided the stage upon which generations of Argentines have built their societies, pursued their dreams, and faced their challenges. The geographic legacy that we explored at the beginning of our journey continues to influence contemporary Argentina in countless ways. The fertility of the soil continues to provide the foundation for agricultural prosperity. The vast distances continue to present challenges for national integration and development. The natural resources continue to offer opportunities for economic growth and diversification. The scenic beauty continues to inspire artistic creation and attract visitors from around the world. But geography alone has never determined Argentina's destiny. At every stage of the nation's development, human choices, creativity, and determination have shaped how geographic advantages were utilized and geographic challenges were overcome. The indigenous peoples who first inhabited these lands developed sophisticated adaptations to diverse environments. The Spanish colonizers created new forms of society that combined European institutions with American realities. The independence leaders forged a nation from colonial fragments. The immigrants and their descendants built one of the world's most prosperous societies. Contemporary Argentines continue to seek ways to realize their country's enormous potential while addressing persistent challenges. The story of Argentina demonstrates both the possibilities and the complexities of nation building in a diverse, resource-rich, and geographically challenging environment. It shows how geography creates opportunities that human societies can develop in various ways, and how the same geographic features can be advantages or constraints depending on technological capabilities, institutional arrangements, and political decisions. It illustrates how national identity emerges from the interaction between inherited landscapes and the dreams and struggles of successive generations of inhabitants. As you reflect on this journey through Argentina's history and geography, remember that the story is far from complete. Contemporary Argentines continue to write new chapters in this ongoing narrative, facing new challenges and creating new possibilities while building upon the remarkable legacy of those who came before them. The plains and mountains, rivers and coasts that provided the foundation for this story continue to offer their gifts to each new generation, while the accumulated wisdom, institutions, and culture created over centuries of human experience provide resources for addressing whatever challenges and opportunities the future may bring. In the quiet moments, as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine the vast spaces of Argentina, stretching from the subtropical north to the subantarctic south, from the peaks of the Andes to the shores of the South Atlantic. In these spaces, the echoes of ancient peoples blend with the voices of Spanish colonizers. The dreams of independence heroes mix with the hopes of millions of immigrants, and the struggles of contemporary Argentines continue the long human conversation with this remarkable land. The story continues, as it always has, in the eternal dialogue between geography and human aspiration that defines not only Argentina, but all the places where human beings have sought to build their versions of home.